refute us, and I'm happy to stand corrected. And we hope that this book will inspire many others to write more details about this kind of thing going on. And we hope people will argue that, some people will argue against us that, this business of sponsoring minorities against the nation is okay. I mean, I would like to argue back if some people are going to say that, which I think they will. Or if some people are going to say that certain groups in the West that we have explained in a certain way are not really doing that, maybe, or maybe they're doing it unconsciously. That's fair enough. That may well be the case. So that's my side of the situation. So you want to give your background and your life interest in this topic and how we are here together.
Because first, how I came to know of a Dravidian Christian movement is existing in Tamil Nadu was through my wife. Like, she is a Christian. So when she was going to her office, one of her friends who knows about my religious background, she gave her a book telling that the whole Hinduism has come from Christianity, so why don't you ask your husband to get converted? So she gave me the book. It was an eye-opener because it showed that there is an entity getting fabricated which is called Dravidian Christianity, and a lot of Christians, innocent Christians, were buying this. They were under the impression that somehow they are again finding their roots without giving up their religion. So, using their sentiments, their patriotic sentiments, this Dravidian Christianity was getting fabricated with institutional support. My father is a Tamil professor, so I know from the beginning how this Dravidian Christianity was getting created. At that time, the entire Christian scholarship laughed at it. They told that we don't have anything to do with this crackpot theory, we are shunning that theory. But the very same students of my father are now encouraging that theory. So I was seeing this change. Unfortunately, I could not discuss this with a person who would listen. It was at that time I came to know of Sri Rajiv Malhotra, and he understood this problem, and he opened up another world, and I could see that there are puppets here and there are string pullers elsewhere. So I was getting the macro picture of the whole thing. Slowly he showed me how the West is institutionally controlling populations in India. And it was amazing to see how what we have been thinking that a discourse developed by our own people is actually a discourse that has been imposed on them by the Western people for their own ends. And our people are being co-opted into that without their knowledge. They are thinking that they are doing the right thing. And there are people who know very well what they are doing in India who are also being co-opted. Of course, we don't have any idea of who are the persons who are intentionally working with the West and who are the persons who are innocently getting sold out. And what we have done is, we have put together the facts here, nothing else. Mostly, the facts have been given here, the facts speak for themselves, and any reader who reads this should understand where he is in this grand geopolitical chess game. And I'm really thankful to Rajiv Malhotra for giving this opportunity, for showing me how the local factors are having global connections, and how we are becoming puppets in the hands of somebody else.
There is no more local. Everything is global.
The boundaries are getting...
Yeah.
Yes.
What is called local is a kind of is part of a global enterprise. So when Pizza Hut is selling some paneer pizza and all that, it's a local flavor, but it's owned by, it's franchised by, it's controlled by, governance by a global enterprise. So we have to see, in the globalization era, we have to see everything in a different context. And somebody who may look like a small minority may actually be a branch office of a global majority. And they of course will hire local looking people, local dress, local language and customs and symbols, because they want to look as local as possible. But who controls the string? Who are the controlling people on the trusts who fund it, who give the ideology, who appoint the management? Those are the things that we have to look. And if we applied the criteria for deciding who controls a corporate entity, like who controls a local, McDonald's franchise. Maybe even if a certain fast food franchise is 100% owned by some Indian guy, but if there is a control over what will be sold, at what price it will be sold, what the brand name will be, how it will be governed, what will be the management, it is considered a foreign enterprise operating here. So the same criteria if we apply to NGOs and religious organizations that are part of a global mechanism, people will have an eye opener. And so we're not saying that we got a new theory and everybody who's involved in this is necessarily bad and there's a conspiracy, but we want to open eyes to a new discussion. So people can very boldly and confidently ask, okay, who's a minority that is autonomous? And who's a minority that is part of a global enterprise? And the two are minorities of different kinds. I think that has to become a discourse that we have to be able to open.
And another important thing that you have mentioned in that 6 provocations is about institution building. Now, the Indian tradition has had its own idea of institution building, but at one point of time it has become stagnant. Today we need to create institution building with the understanding, an intelligent understanding of all these things. Do you think our book is going to help?
Yeah, well, the book is also meant for people who have this very complacent idea, we are secure for 5,000 years, nothing can touch us and everything is cyclical, and I hear that all the time. And people don't realize that not everything is cyclical. I mean, for instance, the population is going on increasing in one direction, so that is just going to make matters worse for us at one time. Also, if you get co-opted and become a foreign colony, and in this today's global era, it's not going to easily become decolonized like once we could. And in any case, that decolonization took centuries, so we don't want to be slaves again for so long. So we may be at the crossroads of some very serious things that India could face, and the book is a way of just starting the conversation. But let me ask you that we've discussed there are 3 international nexuses, and we've covered one of them. So discuss the other 2 so that people don't think we're just picking on West and all that, but we really think that this is part of a trilogy. So what are the other 2 nexuses that we should be researching ideally?
One is the Maoist nexus, and the another one is the Jihadi forces. Now, with regard to Jihadi forces, it is very important to understand that, and we have also mentioned it in the passing in the book, that India has its own indigenous tradition of Islam, which is actually can be a role model, which can actually be a role model for the entire Islamic community. Indian Islam has produced some of the best personalities in the world. You have Bismillah Khan, and you have great music genius like Bismillah Khan. You have another one, rocket scientist like Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, and they have roots in this soil, though they are very good Muslims. So such a flowering of Islamic genius in India is today being threatened by petrodollar induced Wahhabism, which is co-opting Indian people as cannon fodder for the Wahhabi movement. I think we should concentrate into this. And the human rights movement, which is sponsored by the West, which is elsewhere fighting against the Jihadi movement, is today coming and shaking hands with the Jihadi movement in India so that they can balkanize India. So this is the next important thing that we have to study. We have to see how the Indian Islam is being threatened by the imported versions of Islam, and how we can save those indigenous versions of Islam and create a model for the entire world to see that Muslims also can coexist peacefully with the fellow humans.
What about China's threat in the Maoist incursion via Nepal? First, China may take over Nepal, and it may become a virtual colony. It's possible. And China may also take over not only the Arunachal Pradesh and Bhutan, but maybe some of the other northern belts. They're trying to. I think the Indian intelligence agencies are very suspicious that they're planting some personalities to help them infiltrate into the monasteries in the northern area, because they like to. And they're very long-term thinkers. They're not thinking 5 years. They're thinking very long-term. So, what do you think of that threat? I mean, when you look at all the 3 kinds of foreign nexuses operating in parallel and sometimes in unison, this becomes a pretty important point for people to understand. So what do you think of this as a security ramifications? National security ramifications. People look at it almost like we're thinking of religion and all, but we're thinking of national security.
Yes. This is a very important issue, particularly because after the ethnic problem that was created in Sri Lanka, the really one nation that got real advantage in Indian Ocean was China. It has got a strong foothold today in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lankan people, Sri Lankan Navy is killing Tamil Nadu fishermen, and it is also taking Tamil Nadu fishermen as hostage. And when the fishermen are beaten, when the Tamil Nadu fishermen are beaten in by the Sri Lankan Navy, they don't call them Tamil Nadu people. Interestingly, the Sri Lankan Navy abused Tamil Nadu fishermen as Indian bastards. They didn't tell Tamil Nadu bastards, Tamil bastards, they told Indian bastards. Now this is very interesting because we as a civilization, because the Tamil separatists in Tamil Nadu, they have always been telling that India is not taking care of the Tamil fishermen. But it is not the Tamil fishermen that the Sri Lankan army is attacking. And if you see, more and more we weaken the civilizational bonds, China is grabbing more and more power center in Sri Lanka. And this has become a very serious issue because as we have already discussed in the book also, they are creating a pearl garland of important naval centers throughout the ocean, which has been the civilizational bedrock of Indian civilization. And this is creating a real problem. We have to wake up, and it is not as well defined as in the cases of jihadi forces. We don't know who is cooperating with the Chinese, who is not cooperating with the Chinese. We just simply don't know. China is real big threat, and we need a real intensive work on that Chinese threat perception.
So, just to close, the last chapter of this book is India in the Clash of Civilizations, which talks about the clash of West versus China versus Islam. It is their fight. But how that fight is overflowing and playing itself in Indian soil. India is the territory, the Kurukshetra, where they're fighting each other. Not directly yet. It seemed like they're fighting some human rights problem, and they're fighting some Brahmanical hegemony and some Aryans or Hindus or whatever. It looks like that. Because right now they first want to destroy the common civilizational fabric. But at some point in time, they'll also be fighting each other. Because it's like predators, when they run out of easy prey, then they fight each other. So any expansionist ideology that wants to claim world supremacy will not tolerate another one which also claims the same. So the easy food is the somebody that doesn't have an aggressive, extroverted world conquest mentality, and Indian civilization hasn't ever had that. Is an easy prey to go after them. So it looks like they all have a common interest first, because here is a huge elephant they can eat and keep busy eating, and good food for them for a while. But at some point, they'll have fault lines with each other. Which has started happening in so many parts of Africa and so many parts of Europe, where after the pagans and the local natives were finished off, then it became Islam versus Christianity, or now it will be China versus Islam, and China versus the West. So India could either be a victim of these three fighting it out on our soil, but there's possible turnaround into a positive scenario. The positive scenario is if we can hang together, and if we can develop and give human rights to our own people rather than depending on outsiders, and we can give them prosperity and keep unity in diversity, then we could be a model of diversity, coexistence, pluralism that others may want to follow. So India could export its civilizational model rather than destroying it and becoming a colony of various others. That's the crossroads. That is, you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
So we welcome feedback, including comments, criticisms, arguments, invitations to forums where we can go and argue and debate with other people. It is not being presented as a monologue that we want people to just accept. We just like you to consider that some of the questions raised and problems and issues raised are too complex to be solved very quickly, but they deserve further inquiry.